Hello everyone, in this video I'm going to focus on how I draw black fur but also black wavy fur. So for this video I'm going to focus on a smaller section of this portrait because how I would then tackle the whole portrait would be very similar. So with a black pencil I've mapped in where my darkest shadow is. Although I use straight black, I will throughout the portrait then go over with some darker blues to get that more of a rich colour, but at this moment in time when I'm just mapping in my base layers, I like to just put the black down so that I know where I am when I look back at my reference photo. Now my preferred way of putting my base layers down is with a soft tool or an eye makeup applicator, and I've got some sanded soft pastel sticks to the side of me. Now when I was applying that base layer there was a lot of pastel dust that was falling down onto that paper. That's because I've ordered the wrong eye makeup applicators. I ran out of my soft tools and I had to order these last minute and they don't grip the pastel in the same way. But the process is the same with how I like to put that pigment down on my paper. So when you're drawing black fur, there's something with any other fur really. When you're putting down your base layers, we're not overly focusing on the exact colour that we're putting down. It's more about the values, the lights and your darks. Now colour is important, but when we are just putting our base layers down, we can not have to worry about that to start with because we can refine everything else with future layers on top. So we just want to be indicating at where the lights and the darks need to be. Now, what you can see me doing here is I'm now starting to add the first layer of detail, just starting to hint at the fur direction. There is still no individual fur strokes, that's not at this point yet, but I just do like to add at this stage where my general fur direction is going to be. Now when you're drawing wavy fur, the waves and the curls are never random. They usually are in a set place for a reason. Now obviously the longer the coat, the more wavy and more random these may become. However, they originate from an area for a reason. Now if you take the area above the eye for instance, that there has the eye socket, that bony skeletal structure, so therefore the curls are going to come out a little bit more on that section. So one thing I would recommend is really study your reference photo because that will make such a difference. Now when you're drawing black fur, it's really important to look at that reference photo and be able to see whether or not you think it's a warm colour or a cool colour. Now this is something I speak a lot in my Patreon videos, and it's especially important, I mean regardless of whatever you're drawing, but especially black fur, because it will usually go either way. You can have a highlight that's got more of a purple tone, then you can have another one that's got a bit more of a bluer tone. So it's really important to study that reference photo to make sure the colour that you're selecting is correct for that fur that you're drawing. Now when you hear artists speak of a warm colour and a cool colour, they're referring to where that colour falls on the colour wheel. So if you've got a grey that's a warmer grey, that would contain a bit more of a browner, warmer tone to it. When you've got a cooler grey, they contain more of a bluer tone. So that is something to really bear in mind, and making sure that you're picking that value depending on your reference photo. Now this here of Oreo has a mixture of the two. Above the eye has a little bit more of those warmer tones, whereas the pencil here that I'm using is a grey, but it certainly contains far more of a bluer tone. You can tell that from the lead of the colour of the lead and the barrel of the pencil. So really select your pencils depending on the white balance of your reference photo. You'll also see here that I'm using quite a lot of blues to get that mid-tone and the highlights on top as varied as I can. Most of the time black fur is never black. Very much like white fur, it's very reflective. So we're going to be using quite a lot of purples and blues. Sometimes if you've got some of the grass reflecting up, there will also be some greens in there as well. Now depending if you're just doing a head and shoulder portrait, I sometimes leave those greener tones out if you're not incorporating the grass, because it can look a little bit odd if you've not got the grass in the portrait. Whereas if you've got, just as I've done here, a head and shoulders, the blues and the purples make more sense. It complements the black fur nicely. So I just quickly mentioned that the 1 hour 15-minute version of this is available on my Patreon channel, predominantly real time. I speak you through each bit step by step with in-depth voiceover. I tell you the colours that I'm using, the line art is also provided should you want to have a go at this as well. So going back to the colour selection and knowing whether or not you should be picking a warmer or cooler colour, if that is something that you struggle to identify in your reference photos, I really would advise using an eyedropper tool. You can get them on tablets, you can get them as a free app, and it will help you to actually select the colour that you're looking at in that specific reference photo. It is a really good tool if you are struggling with colour selection. Now, I speak about it a lot in my videos in that colour is not as important as we stress, but it is important. But your values are more so important, because the reason that I say that is you could have two portraits that are exactly the same. One would be the perfect colour, but the contrast is not there, it's looking a bit more flat. Whereas you've got the other one where the colour is ever so slightly different to the reference photo, but the contrast is spot on in that the lights and the darks are really good, and there's a really good difference between the two. That artwork with the higher contrast but slightly different colour will get far more attention than the other one where the colour is spot on but the contrast is not as good. So both of them are really, really important, but when I'm doing especially when you're drawing black fur, we really want to make sure we get that contrast spot on, because you don't want the dog, even though you know it's black, for instance, like with Oreo here, you don't want that to be coming out as a grey dog. It still needs to look like it's black fur. So your contrast when you're drawing black fur is really important, and that is all in your lights and your darks. Now you can see here that I'm building up from dark to light. I'm using various lighter shades of grey to get my detailed layers on top. I can only do that when my base layers are dark enough, otherwise these detailed pencil layers are not going to show up. So one of the most common questions that I'm asked is, why do my pencil details not show up on top? Now, the most common reason for that is your base layers aren't dark enough. So go ahead and make them slightly darker, and then your pencil layers will show up a little bit clearer on top. It's one of the most common reasons. Quite often, especially when we're drawing black fur, black dogs, we're too scared to go too dark. The problem with that is, if you then don't go dark enough, your portrait is not going to ultimately look like a black dog or a black fur, whatever it is that you're drawing. So don't be afraid to go too dark. The good thing with working with pastels on Pastelmat is you can layer endlessly, as long as you don't feel that tooth of that paper, which again I speak a lot in my Patreon videos. You can brighten up that layer that you've put down if you have gone too dark. One of the biggest tips when you're drawing wavy fur such as this is to really study that reference photo and notice what section of the fur overlaps the other. You want to be drawing everything that is behind those areas first, so that you can then overlap the curls and the waves on top. That would be the same process that I would be following if it was a really curly coated, like a poodle, for instance, a pure poodle. The process would be exactly the same. I'm always studying that reference photo and drawing what is closest to the skin first and building the curls up from there. Now in the real-time version, obviously that is a lot clearer to see, but it is all about just studying that reference photo and seeing what curl is in front and behind. Once you've got used to the process of eliminating each curl. Now, I'm not saying you have to draw each curl, because I don't think that's important. As long as you make sure you get the general flow and feel of that coat, that's what I'm aiming for. I'm not counting on that reference photo, for instance, that there are 10 curls in that square inch and so on, because I personally don't think that is going to add any more realism. You still want to make sure you've got enough of the curls in that area, but for me personally, I don't sit there and count each individual curl. So how I'm doing this ear is exactly how I would approach a spaniel's ear, for instance. I'm making sure that I've got the fur that overlaps the background. That's really important to make sure that your portrait doesn't just look like a sticker. Your subject is not a sticker that's just stuck on. We want everything to come together nicely, and that it all looks to be one complete piece. So I will overlap all those details onto the background. That's really quite important. You don't want any harsh lines, especially on a wavy coat like this. There's going to be quite a lot of details that overlap onto that background. What I then start doing is I map in where my basic shadows are, so that I can follow the shape and the flow of that ear. It's really important in order to make sure that you get the flow of that fur, especially when the fur starts to get a little bit longer. That's going to create a few more shapes, a few more waves and a few more curls. And you will see how much of a layering process it is working from dark to light. Now, if you struggle to notice whether or not your drawing has got enough contrast, going back to what I mentioned earlier in the video, you can take a photo of your artwork, turn it into a black and white, and then do the same with your reference photo and turn that black and white into a grayscale, and then compare the two. That way you'll be able to clearly see whether or not your darks are dark enough and whether or not your lights are light enough. And as I say, the good thing with pastels, we can easily change our values. If we need to make an area darker or lighter, we can do that quite easily with the ability of being able to layer lights on top of darks. Something else to bear in mind as well, when you're drawing longer, wavier fur, like this section here that I'm working on, it's more about the clumps and clusters of the fur rather than individual strands. If you look at the fur between his eyes on top of his head there, that is more individual strands. I've got individual pencil strokes. Whereas here, yes, I've got individual pencil strokes, but they're more clumped together. The fur is longer and it's more dense. So that's why it's going to have that appearance more so than individual fur strokes. Now, another thing to bear in mind is the texture of the fur that we're trying to create. This is quite a soft looking fur rather than a fur type like if you had, for instance, a black wiry Jack Russell, that would contain far more shorter and more finer details to create that wiry effect. Whereas with this is going to be much softer looking, so we need to make our pencil strokes replicate that. So you really want a lot of your base layers, those blended layers that we put in, to show through. We're not wanting to cover every single part of our base layers. Each layer that we add adds more depth. The only way we're going to be able to add more depth is to allow those previous layers to show through. Our intention is never to completely cover that previous layer that we spent all that time on. It's all about increasing that realism with each layer that we add. Now, that being said, if we do a wrong layer and we put slightly the wrong different colour down, for instance, with something like this, it's so easy to fix. Pastels are very much like acrylics in that you can tint a colour. So you can use the side of a pencil with a really light hand and just just a really, really light hand, and you can glaze that colour over the top. Tint that colour to get it more to how you want in your reference photo. So here is Oreo's finished portrait. I hope these few little tips in this video were useful. If it was, I'd really appreciate if you give the video a thumbs up because it really does help. And the subscribe button is in the corner, and hit the bell button if you want to get notified of future content. And as I say, the just over 1 hour version of this is available on my Patreon. Now, I will just mention my Patreon channel does focus predominantly on fur types, different breeds, all that kind of thing to help people with their pet portraits. So if that is of interest, then like I said, I'll put the link in the description below. I am having my website rebuilt so that I've got a Patreon library where all the tutorials will be easily listed so that people can see what tutorials are available on my Patreon before they sign up. So yeah, I do hope this video was of use, and thank you for watching.